backstage, you said an interesting sentence. You explained me the similarities of organizing a conference like this and a divorce. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
A divorce is slightly worse than organizing a conference in terms of its impact on your mental health. And only those people who have been through both divorce and organizing conferences can understand this fully. But it's a little bit of wisdom I wanted to share with you this morning.
What is more expensive?
It depends on the conference. I think at Davos is slightly more expensive than a divorce, and DLD is slightly cheaper than
You're
divorce.
right. Have fun with Neil.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I expected an empty hall because I thought you'll all have left for Davos by now. And I'll be speaking just to a handful of people who didn't get invited to the World Economic Forum. I'm honored that so many of you have chosen to stick around, or so many of you weren't invited to the World Economic Forum. In some ways, the contrast between networks and hierarchies is also the contrast between DLD and the World Economic Forum. There's no doubt that the Magic Mountain has a distinctly hierarchical character, whereas this is a network conference. You can tell it's a network conference because there are so many people in the room not listening to the speaker. After all, there's something very hierarchical about being a speaker on a stage. It's got to go. Let's disrupt conferences. Let's all talk at once. You see the problem. Last year, I thought I would remind Germans of something good that happened. Last year, before various disasters struck, a hierarchy defeated a network in one of the most humiliating World Cup finals in all recorded history. And I think the reason that happened was that the key hub of the Brazilian team, Neymar, was not there. And that revealed the nature of the Brazilian network. It was highly fragile. Without him, they were in disarray, and a traditional hierarchical Mannschaft was able to shaft them in the English sense. Since we're in Germany, I want to take you back to one of the masterpieces of German cinema, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Metropolis is a wonderful allegory for what I want to tell you. What I'm going to do in the next 13 minutes is give you a very simple theory of history. And I want to start with Lang's Metropolis because it encapsulates what I'm going to tell you. If you haven't seen the movie, all you need to know is that Metropolis is the ultimate hierarchical state. The guy at the top of the penthouse of the highest building rules it as an autocrat. But a revolution occurs. The network of the proletariat rises up against the autocrat and unleashes a natural disaster, a massive flood. Hierarchy, network, nature. These are the things that are central to my simple theory of history. It's the interaction between these three things that is the historical process. And you can see this every time you open a newspaper. Ryan just reminded us of the epic fail that was the Obamacare website. A wonderful example of a hierarchy not able to do something that a Silicon Valley company could have done in its sleep. You've got rebellious networks like Anonymous or WikiLeaks disrupting the hierarchical structures we call states. States are the ultimate products of hierarchical organization. We live at a time of disruption of hierarchies. And at the same time, a natural challenge presents itself, what we refer to obliquely these days as climate change. This is the trifecta of history. We move through time in only one possible direction. But the other axes are environmental, over which we have only very limited control, hierarchical structures, such as states, and the networks, the horizontal organizations that spontaneously organize themselves and don't have hierarchical characteristics of command and control. These are the three axes of my simple theory of history. Now, I'm going to focus mainly on networks and hierarchies, because for most of history, man has had only minimal control over his environment. Most of history is essentially peasants trying to scratch a living from a harsh soil at the mercy of the weather and shifts in climate. Only recently have we become numerous enough to impact the Earth's climate, and we're doing it in ways that we didn't mean and can't seem to stop. Let me instead focus on the interaction between networks and hierarchies, because that seems to me to be the main driver of history. Ask yourself a question. Are you a hierarchy person? Or are you a network person? Do you sit in one of those M-form corporate structures that we study at Harvard Business School? Do you have someone who is unmistakably the boss? Are you in a vertical? I'm not. Because universities are networks. They don't really have a hierarchical structure. The minute they gave me tenure, they had no control over me whatsoever, and I've been saying politically incorrect things ever since. So, 3 simple points. Environmental changes we mostly don't control, sometimes but not always incentivize innovation. And innovation usually comes from networks. It tends not to be the hierarchies that have the good idea. Second key point. The networks tend to disrupt established hierarchies. I'm going to give you an example just to illustrate this point, but first let's get the theory straight. And thirdly, hierarchies are able to exploit the benefits of networks. If you think of networks as essentially creating and innovating, the hierarchies extract rents from the networks. And you might ask yourself why that is. And the answer is because networks are vulnerable. And the hierarchies broadly throughout history offer protection. We'll protect your nice, creative network. All you have to do is pay up, mate. Pay up. And in most of history, that deal is so compelling that the rents paid to the hierarchies stifle innovation. That's why history, for most of recorded history, didn't move the dial in terms of economic growth much at all. Most of history is essentially stagnant. It's only really from around 1800 that things happen. Caveat, this is not a deterministic sequence, and it doesn't give you predictive powers. History can't be predicted. It is a process too complex to model. All attempts to reduce this to mathematics are doomed to fail, and that is the central problem of social science when it tries to do history. Okay, let's give you an example. I'll stick to my German theme. A technological innovation, which probably didn't have much to do with environmental change, called the printing press, unleashed a massive revolution in Germany, and then in Europe, and then in the world, that we call the Reformation. And within 100 years, less in some parts of Germany, this innovation was so successful that it gave people an incredibly compelling reason to kill one another. This was called the Wars of Religion, and it culminated with the Treaty of Westphalia in the mid-17th century. The Reformation was a network-driven revolution. Martin Luther's message spread virally because printing presses in German towns transmitted his sermons and writings with unprecedented speed around Central Europe. If we compare, and here's some really excellent work in a paper by a chap named Dittmar, if we compare the volume of books and here the axis takes you from 1495 through to 1635, look at the volume of books, the red line, and look at the price of books, which fell by 99%, you find yourself looking at something very familiar indeed, because exactly the same thing happened in our time with personal computers. So the Reformation is essentially a classic example of disruptive technological change that empowers networks by radically reducing the cost of horizontal communication, and this takes the hierarchies completely by surprise. If the papacy had really known what I'm telling you, they could have ended the Reformation by systematically destroying the hubs of Luther's revolution, the main printing towns of Germany. It didn't happen, and the revolution prevailed. The 20th century, where I spent rather too much of my life, unlike some of you young things, the 20th century was the ultimate hierarchical century. It was the century when the states and empires that had emerged from the chaos of the 30 Years' War ruled the world. They ruled the world through a whole series of hierarchical organizations. Not only states and empires, but also giant corporations. Here's General Motors, 1921, the archetypal hierarchical corporate structure. Some of you still work for companies that have org charts like that. That is so 20th century, darling. The technology of the 20th century facilitated top-down control. Telephones could be tapped. Cinemas monopolized communications. Radios, televisions, telegrams, it all was so easy to control if you were enough of a badass. And Stalin was the most bad of the badasses of the 20th century in terms of his ability to control even the thoughts of Soviet citizens. One illustration of the power of hierarchy in the mid-20th century was that lots of people aged between 17 or even younger in some cases and early 20s unquestioningly donned uniforms and engaged in savage conventional warfare at the orders of middle-aged men with mustaches. It's an absolutely astonishing phenomenon that the young people of the 1930s and 1940s so willingly went to their deaths. Our time is quite different. Our time is more like the 16th and early 17th century. It is a time when technology is empowering networks and destabilizing hierarchies, with the most corrupt, the most ossified, the first to go. That is at least part of the significance of what was misnamed the Arab Spring in 2011. If you look at various measures of internet penetration, and I've done numbers here for China, the United States, and Egypt, the striking thing is, in fact, how similar the numbers are. We've witnessed a remarkable closing of the gap. This is an interesting measure of global equality, that more and more people, even in quite poor countries like Egypt, now have access to social networks and can access those social networks from their telephones. I mean, this makes the printing press of Luther's time seem very cumbersome as a mode of horizontal intercommunication. This is a real challenge to all hierarchical structures, not only states, but also traditional corporations. Anything that is organized on 20th century principles is vulnerable because the costs of networking have gone, like the costs of printing a page in the 1500s, to near zero. But there's a catch. You're all users of the network. You use the internet. Some of you are using it now. Pay attention. I didn't fly all this way, suffering massive sleep deprivation, to watch you check your email. Sir, there's always one. We all use it. We use it too much. We use it late at night when we should be asleep. But we don't all own it. And that's the most interesting thing about this age of networks. All netizens are equal, but as in Orwell's Animal Farm, some are more equal than others. Yes, you're on Facebook, but do you own Facebook stock? Yeah, you absolutely love Google and use it every day up to 20 times, but do you actually own Google? No, you probably don't. Or only indirectly through some pathetic little pension fund that at some point will be raped by the state. No, mostly the network is owned by the people who invented it, who are annoyingly wealthy and have far better intellectual property protection than anybody in the 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th century. Innovators today really get to collect in an almost unprecedented way. The second caveat is that the old hierarchies are not so dumb. I mean, you can say what you like about the US federal government. Yeah, it can't really run a healthcare website, but when it comes to spying on not only US citizens, but absolutely everybody in the world, it has set new records under this president. Richard Nixon, were he alive, would look in amazement at the achievements of the NSA under President Obama. An amazingly successful program of surveillance, exploiting, this is from the famous PRISM task force presentation that got leaked, exploiting, look in the bottom left-hand corner, the providers, Google, Yahoo, etc. The networks look to be winning. But have they in fact been co-opted by the hierarchies? At the end of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, there's a revolution, a kind of movie Götterdämmerung that brings the whole hierarchical structure of Metropolis crashing down. There are still people who fantasize about this happening in our time, though they mostly write for the Guardian newspaper and some left-wing newspapers like the Süddeutsche Zeitung in this country. I'm here to tell you that this is not going to happen. It is not going to happen because despite the inequality that Thomas Piketty and others, not to mention Oxfam, have become so agitated about, A, the world as a whole is becoming more equal, so this is kind of a red herring, and B, the hierarchy has figured out how to coexist with the new networks. Metropolis lives. And if you don't believe me when I tell you that Metropolis lives, you haven't visited the Googleplex. There, I finished with 2 minutes to spare. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Niall Ferguson. Ladies and gentlemen, Niall